Welcome to the launch of Durrell's Rewild Carbon, a colourful and impactful way of offsetting carbon emissions that is not just sticks of carbon, but actually building a rainforest. This project is going to cater for biodiversity, targeting some of the rarest species on Earth, and also helping local communities. So we're here this evening at Government House in Jersey. It's an absolutely beautiful setting, it's a glorious evening, and we'd like to thank Government House for giving us the opportunity to have the event here. We'd also like to thank very much Quilterchievia, our sponsors for the evening, who are making this possible. We've had some fantastic support already, and I'm sure after this evening we'll have many more companies want to come on board with what is an amazing project. For those of you joining us online this evening, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the comments. We're monitoring the comments online and we'll do our best to answer any question you have. Thank you so much for coming along this evening to hear about Rewild Carbon on this, our launch evening. It's a project we've been working on for quite some time, and we're really excited to now properly share that with all of you. Now, the first speaker I would like to introduce this evening is Andrew Mitchell. Now, many of you will know Andrew, but Andrew's reputation is a global one. He is an international thought leader on natural capital finance and tropical forests. And he has an extensive history in looking at how we treat our natural world, what are the kind of commodities that we use in the natural world, and how do we track them to better understand our impact. So Andrew is based here on Jersey now, and in 2017 he founded his consultancy Equilibrium Futures, and that provides strategic advice to things like family offices and wealth managers. He also was the founder of Global Canopy, and that is an international think tank that looks at the landscape around things like green bonds. So we're going to leave it up to Andrew to kind of set the scene of where we are right now in the world and what nature-based solutions might look like in relation to carbon and climate change. So Andrew, it's over to you.
Thank you, Lesley. Thank you. It's good to be here, isn't it? Feels kind of funny, doesn't it? I don't think I've been to an event like this since when? 15 months ago at least. So it feels a little funny. But why are we here? Why are we all 1 meter distanced? Why are we all having to sit down? We can't have a drink standing up. It's all because of a tiny little thing we can't even see. A little speck of nature. And I'm spending a lot of time with the finance industry these days to try to change the movement of money. Because I believe if we don't change the movement of money, we'll continue to finance ourselves into extinction. Now, that sounds a bit of a shocking thing to say. But the thing that's really made the penny drop in the last 15 months has been coronavirus. Because that is nature at work. In 2017, I was talking to the UK Treasury and trying to explain to them the importance of nature-related financial risk. And they said, we're really busy doing climate now. Can't nature wait? And then they'd say, well, it's not going to affect very many sectors. It's just about agriculture. Okay, agriculture is destroying a lot of nature. And it's all to do with that sector and a lot of finance, not a big piece of GDP. And anyway, it's really difficult. So go away. And then in April last year, I wrote a piece for the World Economic Forum saying that COVID-19 would be the $10 trillion wake-up call to the finance sector from nature. I said, you can't say that, Andrew. You can't write $10 trillion. That'd be ridiculous. We'll call it something else. Well, currently the bill's about 12.5 trillion and counting. In fact, the International Monetary Fund said it's as high as 22. Because of all the money governments are having to pump out to keep us all going, to keep all our businesses going. This is nature at work. It's nature at work because we've been taking a kind of, booze and burger mentality to the way we run the world for decades. And this stuff is coming home to roost now. and we get ourselves into the extinction business. Lesley's in the extinction business. She's trying to stop it. That's why she has one of the best places in the world that's doing that. But part of this, they need money, and we have to get on that first step on this journey to get our financial capital into a better state of equilibrium with natural capital. And I'm just going to tell you a few stories, just why I've come to that kind of conclusion in 40 years of working at the conservation front line and now working at the front line of this with the finance sector, not just here in Jersey, but also worldwide. I mean, look at the rhino there. When I was a young biologist in Tsavo National Park in Tsavo East, there were 16,000 rhino in the park. We get charged every day if we went out in a rhino. One of them stuck its horn right through the side of the Land Rover. It was fun. There are only 6 left in the wild there, last time I counted, and about 50 of them are still in caged environments. 16,000 down to less than 50 in my lifetime. It's functionally extinct. On the horn there, you can see why. It's all data from trading platforms on the horn, because the value of rhino horn is bigger than gold. And I learned from that it's no use just trying to kill poachers if you want to solve those problems. You have to kill the market for rhino horn, and nobody ever has, so they're gone. The second picture on there, that's me a few years ago, and I was trying to think, when was it? But the graph, I don't know, you won't be able to see it, but that graph there is showing you the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And I'm standing on top of a platform about 60 meters up in the middle of the Amazon. And just on the tower, you can't see it, there was a little ticker going tick, 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 and it was measuring the CO2 in the atmosphere. And it was 382 parts per million. So I can look at the graph and I can work out it was roughly around about 2005 that I was there, because that's when it's that number. Look how much it's gone up. It's now 419 parts per million. Look at the inexorable rise of that graph. Nobody can deny that CO2 is not increasing in the atmosphere. What is debatable amongst some is it us or is it natural? But it's really taken off since the Industrial Revolution. And hello, it's probably something to do with us because of all the emissions we're putting in the atmosphere. And that's what tonight is about. How do we stop putting our emissions up there in the atmosphere? It's a simple mathematical thing. More CO2, the hotter it gets. Why are we having 47 degrees in Seattle this week? Bigger than anything they've ever seen before. People dying because of heat. In Australia, I remember writing a report and predicting that possums would fall out of the trees because of heat. It happened about 2 years ago when the temperatures got so high in northern Australia, the possums can't cope with heat like that. They started just falling out of the tree, and the bats as well. That's the extinction business. We don't want that to happen. So we've got to deal with these emissions, and on a really big scale. And so I really learned about that. Here's another story. This is an orangutan. I was in Jersey Zoo when I was young and touching baby orangutans through the bars. You could do that then, Lesley. You can't do it anymore. I get rounded up and carried away. I used to be able to walk the cheetahs around the car park with Jeremy Mallinson too. You can't do that anymore, not least because Jeremy isn't here anymore. But I was in Borneo and I had a little young orangutan called Doyok. I was looking after him for the day with a wonderful woman called Biruti Galdikas. And we protected big areas of forest there, and that's really where orangutans live today. And Doyok, I was saying to him as I walked through the forest, who are you going to be when you grow up? You know, what's your forest going to be like? It's just getting smaller and smaller. And the emissions from burning trees, which you can see all around, are huge, bigger than the transport and aviation industry combined. And no one was talking about them in the international negotiations. They were just talking about energy. And I had to go in there and explain about forests with many others and say, if you don't fix forest burning, you will not be able to fix climate change. With all the energy mitigation, it won't do it on its own. You have to fix this too. And so I explained this to Doyok, and he thought this was very dull and boring. And when I took him back to camp, he escaped. I was very worried about him because he was too young to live in the forest. He was an orphan from the palm oil industry. His mother had been shot with a gun, died, fell out of the tree. The people took him as a tiny baby orangutan, brought him up as a pet, used to get people to pay to see him, kept him in a cage. He arrived with no hair. It takes years to rehabilitate these babies back into the forest. And he was too young and not ready. He was almost certainly going to die. I felt really bad about that. It wasn't until about 25 years later that I saw this picture in National Geographic. And it said Doyok, king of the orangutans. It was Doyok. He had survived, and he'd come back to the camp where he was brought up, and there he is sitting on one of the benches at the camp. It's a story of hope, isn't it? Doyok. And I was so pleased that he'd survived. And we all need to get on board with this. It's not a joke. We can't just sit about on the sofa watching David Attenborough films with our daughter or son, and when we go to work, we forget about all that and invest in the very things that are causing the destruction of nature around the world. What sense is that? So what can we do? Well, when I came back here last year, I was asked to help Jersey Finance prepare Jersey for Good, which is a strategy for Jersey to become the leading finance center for sustainable finance, the leading international finance center in the markets it serves by 2030. We published that in March this year, and a pathway for the first 2 years. We're getting everyone on board now. This is something that everyone in the island can be part of, not just the finance industry, but also companies here. And you can't have green finance on a brown island. We've got to make the island itself be green. And everyone has a chance to do this in different ways. And one way is through Lesley, because if you offset your emissions whilst you try to bring them down, that's better than not offsetting them. Because why wait? You could be carbon neutral tomorrow if you want to. Go and talk to Lesley. But if you just forget all about it, they say, well, I'm really going to deal with the lights and I'm going to look at my investments and I'm a company, I'm trying to reduce my emissions, but I'm going to forget about the ones I've got today. You're allowing all these destructive things to continue. You can do better than that. So there are physical risks, transition risk, litigation risk. Litigation, watch out for litigation. It's coming. The new AML requirements that are going to be published next month include things like, are you funding illegal deforestation or illegal fishing? Illegal fishing is one of the biggest causes of fraud in the world. It's massive. And it gets laundered through IFCs. Be careful. FATF is going to come looking and seeing, are you doing the right thing or not? So this litigation stuff is going to get really big. TNFD, that's a framework that I'm developing with a whole bunch of finance institutions and governments at the moment called the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. You might have heard of the Task Force on Climate Disclosure, which Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg did. Well, we're doing the same thing, but for nature. And I'm delighted to say that just this month, it was launched on the 10th of June with David Craig, who's head of Refinitiv, that some of you may know, is quite a reasonable credit ratings agency, and also Elizabeth Mrema, who you won't know, but she's head of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So we're putting the money and nature together to build this task force over the next 3 years. So, but look at this too. We hear a lot about carbon capture and storage. That basically means putting a machine on top of some refinery or putting it on top of a big power station, capturing the carbon and liquidizing it and putting it under the ground in the North Sea where we took the oil out. Sounds great, doesn't it? Everybody's really excited about it. The trouble is it costs about $400 a ton, or somewhere between there and $200 a ton. And I go to ministers and say, that's great for creating jobs. It makes you feel good. It's really expensive. I've got a fantastic machine that's been invented quite a long time ago that can do it around about $10 to $30 a ton on a massive scale. And they say, tell me what it is. And I say, it's a tree. That's what Lesley's doing. It's cheap. It's nature's solution. They've had 4 billion years to work it out. Why was there 95% CO2 in the atmosphere? And today, how much is there? Who can tell me how much CO2 is in the atmosphere today as a percentage? It was 95% before. Anyone know? 20%? 10%? Is 0.04%. That's how little it is and how sensitive it is. But what took all that CO2 out was not machines. It was trees and plankton. As simple as that. Quite a long time. Nature can do it. So we can't do this just with machines and technology. We need to have nature-based solutions because those are the ones that the world has always used. They're tried and tested and simple. And the methodologies for doing this have been really well worked out over the recent decades. They're into compliance markets. They're very well tried and tested in the voluntary carbon market. And that's the area that Lesley's in. And if you do choose to get involved in this, you get a whole lot more because, you know, that goo that comes out of a power station that you pump in under the North Sea, all you've got is a ton of black goo. It doesn't do anything else. A ton of Lesley carbon is alive. It gives you so much more. It gives you nature. It gives oxygen. It looks after local people. So it's a premium carbon credit. And that's why at the COP26 coming up in Glasgow, you're going to hear a lot about natural climate solutions, a realization that we can't win this unless we invest in those sort of solutions. And it gives you so much more than many of the other solutions. We have to do it all. We can't just do one or the other. We've got to do it all. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Lesley to tell you how it works. Thank you.
I'm very excited about the idea of Lesley carbon. That's great. Not just this carbon here. That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. I think that really set the scene for what we're talking about this evening. I'd now like to ask Tim Child of Quilter Cheviot, the head of their international and Jersey office, to say a few words about why they are getting involved with Rewild Carbon and why it's important to them.
On behalf of Quilter Cheviot, we are delighted to be involved in such an important and inspiring initiative. In fact, I'm standing in the Jewels of the Forest enclosure at Jersey Zoo, which is a really fitting venue in which I'm giving this introductory speech. My role is Head of International and Jersey Office at Quilter Cheviot Investment Management, and we are the official launch partner of Rewild Carbon. Within the last decade, we have seen our clients' financial objectives progressively align more with their ethical values. David Attenborough and Greta Thunberg have really made us all question our lifestyles and the impact we have on our planet. In order to implement positive change, we must offer solutions which provide the smoothest transition to sustainable alternatives with minimal disruption. The same can be said when it comes to investments. Before we became more conscious of our environmental and social impact, these values had little impact on the investments we made. Fast forward to today. Discussing ethical values between a client and investment manager is as necessary as determining their risk preference and financial objectives. As investment managers, the use of funding being harnessed optimally is important to us. To provide some background, Quilter Cheviot is a wealth manager who offers clients long-term sustainable options for their investments. In fact, we were one of the first investment managers to launch a fund that invests around the world with a focus on investment opportunities arising from the convergence of climate change, resource scarcity, and population shifts. Having launched the Climate Assets Fund 11 years ago, Quilter Cheviot is no stranger to investing in environmentally friendly companies. Indeed, it now manages sustainable investment mandates totaling £350 million. In addition to the Climate Assets Fund, Quilter Cheviot launched a positive change strategy in March this year. This strategy will target funds looking to make a difference through voting and engaging with companies. We know that more solutions are needed to tackle the issues facing the environment and society, and that businesses need to take further action to become more sustainable. Whilst engagement is a key factor within our investment process, it is important that we have our own house in order. At Quilter Cheviot, we are constantly looking at ways to improve our environmental impact. Most recently, we have started to develop an online portal for clients and advisors to access all the relevant documentation they need with regards to their investments. This eliminates the need to print and distribute physical reports unnecessarily, saving over 5 million sheets of paper each year. While this might seem like a drop in the ocean, we hope this will encourage other businesses to follow our lead. This year marks Quilter Cheviot's 250-year anniversary, so it's an understatement to say we have a significant amount of experience working with clients and protecting their wealth. We have been managing assets through different market environments, from the global financial crisis in 2008, back to the Great Depression after the First World War, and even the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. But looking forwards to the next 250 years, we must engage with the next generation, who have a more sustainable mindset than previous generations. They are twice as likely to invest in companies targeting social or environmental goals. I would like to close my address with a fitting quote from Sir David Attenborough at the recent G7 summit. G7 leaders face some of the most important decisions in human history as they tackle the climate change crisis. The decisions we make this decade, in particular, the decisions made by the most economically advanced nations, are the most important in human history. Thank you.
Rewild Carbon, it's been quite a few months in the making. Before we start, I'd also just like to thank the For Hire group. They came on board really early, so they have helped make this possible this evening to really look into detail of what we wanted to do. If we were going to offer a climate solution as Durrell, it had to be a Durrell-made solution and something that we could feel really proud about. Now, you've probably all seen this image. It's quite a well-known image now. You know, there's the wave of COVID, and then there's the financial impact, and then there's the really, really big waves. Climate change and biodiversity loss. Now, we have thrown a phenomenal amount of money at COVID. As Andrew said, you know, government debt is about 20 trillion higher now than it was previous to COVID. So government debt is stacking up enormously. And that's because we recognise the serious threat that was COVID. It was an emergency, and it was happening to us right now. That's good. That shows us humans, we can tackle big, big problems. But what we are absolutely useless at doing is recognising long-term risk and understanding long-term risk. At the moment, we invest less than $100 billion a year in conservation of nature. Some estimates is around $60 billion a year. Now, the return on that investment, if we look at ecosystem services and valuations, the top-end valuation of that return is $144 trillion a year. Brilliant business sense to invest a little bit more in conserving that. But at the moment, we're not putting anywhere near enough money into stabilising our climate, trying to mitigate the emissions we already have, and protecting nature. And biodiversity loss, it sometimes is seen like the poor cousin. It's lagging behind climate change. There's roughly 10 times more coverage in newspapers of climate change than there is of biodiversity loss. But biodiversity loss is a serious, serious thing. If we just take pollinators as a single unit, the pollinators of the world and what their impact will be if they go. Now, about 75% of all human food crops are pollinated by animals. So the consequences for humanity are very stark if the pollinator populations worldwide collapse, and they are in serious decline. So these are the big problems, but they're hard to see. We can't see them in front of us as easily as we could see COVID. But right now, about 23 million people a year are displaced by weather events. And it's estimated by 2050, perhaps 1 billion people will be displaced every year by weather events and the wars that will result from ecological collapse. So these are the consequences that are coming towards us down the train tracks. But we keep putting it off. You know, we set these international targets. We've just passed the 2020 Aichi targets for biodiversity. Out of the 20 targets, we met maybe 4. And now we're talking about 2030 targets. That's a long way away. So we need to do things now. We need to do things immediately. So when we thought about what we wanted to do as Durrell, what was the impact we wanted to have, we thought about, who are we? Who are Durrell? So we've got a very long track record. We have been in existence 62 years. We're well trusted in the conservation sphere. In fact, there was a paper published last year that showed that of all avoided bird and mammal extinctions of the past 3 decades, Durrell has either been the lead partner or a key player in nearly 20% of all avoided extinctions. So we make a big impact for an organisation our size, and we are globally renowned in the conservation world. But that's for our biodiversity work. So what do we want to do in terms of carbon? Of course, we have been sequestering carbon for a long time. We just didn't call it that. All our habitat restoration work, our avoided deforestation work, of course, that is sequestering carbon, but we haven't measured it like that. We haven't thought about it in those terms. But the places we work are also these incredible, rich environments with some of the rarest species on Earth, some of the most attractive species on Earth, species that have all kinds of benefits in terms of the functioning of an ecosystem. So the project we're going to tell you about tonight has all these cool benefits built in. It's not just carbon, it's carbon and livelihoods and biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's a one-stop shop for all your ESG needs. That's how you can look at it. And we are a not-for-profit. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit later about why we have chosen not to be certified. And you might be quite surprised by that initially, but if I show you some of the figures, then you'll understand our thinking. And as an organisation, we're very much about measuring our impact and understanding it. We are the only conservation organisation in the world that has an organisational level impact factor, the Durrell Index. And we take measuring really, really seriously. Because, of course, if something's going wrong, we need to pivot. So we very much believe in adaptive management of all our projects, in doing the right thing if it's going off course. So I think all those things combined has put us in a really good place to address the climate issue as well. Because we want to do more than sticks of carbon. Now, Andrew talked about the super machine that is a tree, and they are incredible super machines, but they're not just sticks of carbon, but quite often you'll see projects that are really just monoculture plantations of eucalyptus. They are a disaster for biodiversity, but they're also not that good at sequestering carbon. So if you take a species-rich forest, some of the estimates, it's up to 40 times more carbon sequestered than a monoculture plantation. So why wouldn't you protect the forest instead of planting those sticks of carbon in a row? That is not what we wanted to do. So the projects that we're putting together, and this is the first of several, we hope, they're really rich projects. They're looking at the bigger picture of how we offset. Now, I should say, I don't particularly like the word offset. I know Andrew's not keen on the word offset because it sounds like you're avoiding something. It sounds a bit grubby. You're trying to push something aside. So offset's not a brilliant term, but it is a descriptor that we have in the market at the moment. So why would we offset as businesses? Well, I think there's a long list of reasons that we would offset. For me, the first one, of course, is the ethical imperative to offset. This is all our world. And we all have a vested stake in making it as healthy as possible for our future, our children, our grandchildren. And particularly we, as Westerners, we are very privileged, we're very lucky. The impacts of climate change are being felt right now, not in most terms by Westerners. They're being felt by some of the poorest peoples on Earth who will be most quickly affected by our actions. So I think there's a strong ethical factor. But, of course, there's a changing landscape out there. Young people want to work for companies that take their sustainability credentials seriously, so you'll get the best staff. Customers want to engage with companies who are taking it seriously, so you'll attract more customers. So there are some business reasons for doing it as well. And Andrew also mentioned that the regulation is coming in, which I think will change the landscape. And we only have to look, for example, at the court case in the Netherlands a couple of weeks ago with Shell to see that the tide is changing. Litigations are going up across the world for what's called ecocide-type crimes. That's only going to increase. There's also, of course, the move from some countries, like New Zealand, for example, to bring in mandatory climate disclosures. Once the Task Force on Nature-Based Disclosures has reported in a few years from now, I think we'll also start to see mandatory nature-based financial disclosures. Your balance sheet going forward is not going to look like it does now. Your balance sheet will have your profit and your loss in economic sense, but it will also be measuring your environmental impact, your impact on livelihoods, your impact on community. So balance sheets going forward are actually going to be much more interesting. They're going to be much richer, and they're going to be a true reflection of how we operate as businesses. So it's been said to me by a few people, we're going to offset in 2030. Why? Offset now. Here's a little example. Here's two companies. They've both made really ambitious pledges. They're going to cut their carbon emissions by 60% by 2030. Because, of course, we can't just offset and be done with it. We have to cut our emissions as well. Company A, they've made a really ambitious target. It's really great. And they get all the way to 2030, and then they start offsetting the emissions they have left. They've got the seedlings there, and they're growing a bit. Company B has decided, nope, we're going to get this ambitious target, we're going to work towards it, but we are causing emissions right now, and therefore we're going to take responsibility for it right now. So Company B, they plant the seedlings, they plant more trees every year, they're helping local livelihoods, they're saving species from extinction, and they get to 2030, and because we're planting in the tropics, they've built a forest. And they've done that at the same time. So this is why we have to act now. That's 10 years lost if we don't start doing it now. So the first carbon project that we're launching is this. It's the Atlantic Rainforest Project. And it will be £25 a tonne of CO2 equivalents. Now that looks expensive to some eyes because you'll see some very cheap projects on the market. But they're cheap because they're not doing much at all. That's the reason. But if you look at things like the World Economic Forum and their predictions for carbon prices within the next few years, this will start to look cheap. It's going to rise quite readily. And in particular, those projects that have lots and lots of co-benefits like this. So we are partnering in Brazil with the Instituto de Pesquisas Ecológicas. From now on in the talk, I will call it IPE. Now, IPE have been long-term partners with us. We have worked with them a very long time, and it's a very warm relationship. The gentleman with the binoculars is Professor Claudio Padua. Claudio was our very first Brazilian trainee. So many of you might know that we have a training academy here in Jersey. We have one in Mauritius, we have one in Madagascar, but the original one is here on Jersey, and we bring conservationists, young conservationists from all over the world. We bring them to Jersey, they live with us for 3 months, and they learn so many different things. Claudio came to us in 1982. He went back to Brazil and he founded IPE. It is now one of the biggest conservation NGOs, actually one of the biggest NGOs in Brazil. But it didn't stop there, because Claudio sends his team to us as well. So over the years, we've trained many of Claudio's team. The gentleman in the corner, the bottom corner, you're going to hear from him later. That's Dr. Lowry Cullen. Lowry came to us in 1992 and has since gone on to be an incredible conservationist. He's done some amazing work, groundbreaking reforestation work. And the lady holding the little tamarin, that is Gabby Rezende, soon to be Dr. Gabby Rezende. She's about to finish her PhD. She came to us in 2013. Now, they all have something in common, Claudio, Lowry, and Gabby. They are all winners of the Whitley Prize. The Whitley is the Oscars of conservation. We're very lucky some of our staff have won the Whitleys as well. Gabby won the Whitley Award last year. So these are incredibly high quality conservationists. So we're partnering with them. And we do that in every country we work. We partner with local NGOs because they understand the local communities as well. So what's the challenge that we're trying to face down? Now, in Brazil, the Mata Atlântica, the Atlantic coastal rainforest, is in the south of Brazil, mostly in Sao Paulo state. It's an incredible rainforest. It is the older rainforest of the two. If you look at the Amazon or the Mata Atlântica is older. And it holds an enormous diversity within it. About 7% of the world's species are held in the Mata Atlântica. 55% endemic, i.e. they're not found anywhere else. It's an incredible place. But there's not much of it left. It's decreasing. The decrease itself has stabilized a little now. But of the interior forest, there's only about 6% left. And it protects the watershed of 125 million Brazilians. That's a huge number of people dependent on these fragments of forest left. And you can see from the images, it is highly fragmented. That very large bit of green on the map, that is the Morro do Diabo National Park. That's one of the largest fragments remaining. And you can see there's lots of other little tiny fragments there. And fragmentation of forest is a huge problem. You get all kinds of impacts from these fragmentations, particularly around biodiversity and the stress that is felt by biodiversity. Study last year looking at tamarins found that animals living in smaller fragments have higher stress levels, which means their immune systems are weakened, which means they become susceptible to disease, and they also shed viruses. If anything has taught us how important it is about animals shedding viruses, it's the last 18 months. Fragmentation of habitats increases pandemic risk. We know this. So there's many things that we have to tackle. And in the area this project is going to work, there's also a very high incidence of poverty in the local population. Across the Mata Atlantica, it's about 25% of the people live in poverty. In the project region, it's 47%. And you can see there the humanitarian challenge of the landless people. The landless people are simply that. They're people who are displaced and they move around trying to find somewhere to settle in which they can make a living. Now, when the landless people moved to the project area several years ago, Claudio Padua, instead of seeing them as a problem, he's a very smart man, Claudio Padua, and he's also a humanitarian. He saw them as a solution and began working with the landless people in some of the projects they were doing. So that's the scale of the challenge. How do we connect up all these fragments? How do we start to rebuild a forest? So the first part of what this project will do is revive these ecosystems. That you can see there, that is one of the corridors we've already helped build. You can see it's hugging round this pasture land. Because people own the pasture land, but there's a legal basis for building on these corridor areas in terms of restoring them. You have to set aside land in Brazil on your pasture lands, on your farmlands, that has to be turned over to nature. But often the local farmers do not have the capacity, they don't have the funds, they don't have the ability to do it. And this is where we can step in, along with IPE. So there's a forest that was planted in the last 15 years. And it's now connecting up some of these fragments. So what are we going to do? For this first part of the project, we are looking to restore 5,000 hectares strategically. So it's very specific what we're doing. It's not just planting trees in a random fashion, it's very strategic. About 500 of the hectares is for agroforestry, because this is part of the livelihood development for the local people. And they're in these corridors. And it'll take about 7 million trees to do that. With natural recruitment into these growing forests, it'll probably become about 14 million trees over the course of the next few years. And I think some of you probably think that doesn't seem a lot. I'm sure I read in the newspaper about someone planted 10 million trees in a day and all this kind of thing. Yes, but do they nearly survived? Have they followed them up? What's going on with those projects? There's a lot of projects in terms of seed scattering, but you'll see later on that's not the way we do this. It's a much more targeted way because the success of seed scattering is indeterminate at the moment. Now, it so happens that Durrell is actually working on a project with Liverpool John Moores using drone technology to look at the efficacy of seed scattering for tree restoration, for forest restoration, but the data's not in yet, so that might be a future way that we do things. We are going to be planting about 100 different native trees, some of which are themselves endangered species. And then again, natural recruitment will bring in about another 40 species. Now, you will see, as I said earlier, monoculture plantation type projects, but you'll often see people talking about biodiverse projects, and they might be talking about 15 species of trees. This is going to be 140 species of trees. So it's much more diverse. And this is the comparison between an intact forest and the pasture land next to it. So on an intact forest per hectare, you'll be looking at about 100 different species of mammals in somewhere as biodiverse as the Mata Atlantica. Many different species of bird. It's entirely depauperate on the pasture lands. Certainly no trees at all. And it's sequestering very little carbon. So when we're planting the tree corridors, again, it's not random in the way we do it. So we'll be including trees that are in self-endangered, but what we will be doing, the edge trees and some of the central trees will be particular types of species which are fast growing, really hardy. When they grow, their canopies expand very quickly. They dampen down the invasive grass that might grow below. And then we add in other species that take a little bit longer, and we add in and we add in. And you start to get this mosaic and a much more naturalized forest growing. And the seedlings, we grow them in little nurseries, and then we look after them for at least 3 years. At least 3 years, those little seedlings are nurtured. If it dies, another tree is planted. Not at additional cost to you, another tree is put in its place to make sure that we get as much success as possible. And because it's the tropics, it's growing incredibly quickly. Now that's a blue morpho butterfly. If you come up to the zoo and go to the butterfly house, we have blue morphos. You can see them there. But it'll take about 2 years and there'll be blue morphos going through those tiny forests. In about 7 years, you've actually got quite tall canopy. You've got a functioning forest, and we'll start to see larger animals going through it. So it happens very, very quickly once you invest and you plant strategically. And of course, not only is it reviving that ecosystem, it's then beginning to sequester carbon. And as I said earlier, species-rich forests sequester much more carbon. This is one of the nurseries growing all the little seedlings. And that's where the work of the local community comes in, where they're paid to grow the seedlings and nurture them and look after them. So over the course of this first 5 years of the trees that we plant now, what they will sequester in their lifetime is nearly 2 million tonnes of carbon. Now, if we can expand the project, if we get through this first 7 million trees, we'll plant more. There's many, many corridors we can plant. This is the first couple of corridors of this project. So the sky's the limit. There's no end of trees we can plant in the Mata Atlantica. And I'm just going to read you a quote from a paper that was published recently. According to a study published in the journal Nature, the biome of the Mata Atlantica is part of a group of ecosystems in which the restoration of 15% of the area would prevent 60% of the predicted extinction of species, and at the same time would sequester the equivalent of 30% of the CO2 released into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That's a group of biomes together. So that kind of targeted planting of trees to create ecosystems again is highly, highly effective and much, much cheaper than carbon capture by machinery. As Andrew said, you just get a bunch of sludge that way. Here, you get amazing species and livelihoods for people. So the project itself, we're aware that, of course, the offset market has some shady projects in it. We have to be honest. There are some not very good projects out there. There's some great projects, but there's some really not very good ones. So how do we approach this? Well, as Durrell, I think we've always had a very ethical approach to what we do. It's very important to us. You know, our reputation rests on our projects. So we thought very carefully, and we've built in an insurance buffer of 20%, which means, for example, the area that we're going to be working in has got quite a high instance of lightning strike. So there could be natural fire. So we put that buffer in. So if we have instances like that, it's not impacting on the sequestered carbon that you would be purchasing. And then we reduce the estimates. We're very conservative about the carbon calculations to make sure that you are really getting what we say you're getting in terms of sequestered carbon. So we've been quite conservative about it to be as sure as possible of our calculations. So we have an in-house registry, and each ton of carbon, there's serial numbers, we can track them. That's very important. There's been occasions where in the past with other projects, you'll see carbon being sold twice. We don't want to make those mistakes, so we have a very rigorous system for doing that. And the monitoring and evaluation. Now, what we do is monitor and evaluate. We've got an entire team called Conservation Knowledge, and within that, we have an entire team called Conservation Effectiveness. And that's the people who measure, and they measure, and they measure, and they measure. And of course, our partners in Brazil are doing the same. Not only will we be using things like satellite imagery, we'll be using drone detection, we'll be looking at measuring the trees as they grow, and looking at the carbon estimates and the rapidity of the growth. There'll be camera traps looking at the animals. There'll be soundscapes. There'll be every kind of possible measurement that we can think of, because from our own perspective, we want to measure as much as possible to understand what is going on in that forest and understand the impact that we're having and what we have to might change. For example, one thing that became apparent when we built some of the corridors, the earlier corridors, and we were hoping that the tamarins would move along the corridors to go into these different areas. And they weren't doing it. They were going in during the day and then going back at night. And of course, it became abundantly apparent that, of course, they didn't feel safe at night. The trees weren't old enough to have broken beams, so you get little tree hollows. There wasn't enough safe spots. So what we did, we trialled nest boxes up at the zoo in the tamarin woods. I'm sure you've all seen the tamarins running around in the woods. That was our little tiny experimental Brazilian rainforest. We tested several different types of nest boxes. We let the tamarins choose which ones they liked. They had a very clear choice. And those are now in use in Brazil, in the corridors with wild tamarins. So we can find solutions to these problems. And we can use our zoo here in Jersey to help find those solutions. And it was a very neat and, in the end, quite simple way of doing it. But that helps, that kind of connectivity while the forest develops. Ultimately, though, rewilding is all about getting to a point where we take our hands off and the ecosystem functions again. But that might take a little bit to get to. So I said earlier, we have decided not to certify the project. And at first we thought we were going to, but the more research that we did, the more concerned we were about the costs of certification and what was not going into the environment. So with a Rewild Carbon project, 95% of the cost is in the project itself. We did some research looking at typical certified projects. And what you find is there's a lot of administration costs. There are costs around shareholder profits. There are all kinds of costs going in. Rewild Carbon, it looks like that. So a little black bit, that's the administration costs. We're keeping that as low as we can. So some of the certified projects we saw, on average, about 40 to 60% might not go into the actual project. We saw a couple of projects where it was 80% of the costs was in certification itself. And it also places quite a large burden on local communities, certification, and it takes time. And we thought, nope, we want to do it right now. And I would also, we'll blow our own trumpet here. Who's going to certify Durrell about biodiversity? We're the experts. We know how to do that. And we're not looking to make a profit. We want to do it right, because this is our reputation as well. So if you invest with us, your money is really going into the project. We actually also saw some projects where they were certified and they weren't sequestering any carbon whatsoever. Now, there's some good projects out there that are certified. I wouldn't diss all good certified projects, but for us, we feel this is the choice that we would like to make in that voluntary carbon market. And coming down to the species, what we're known for. So our mission statement, the only mission statement we've had in 62 years, is saving species from extinction. That's it, those 4 words. That's what we do. And this little chap here, that is a black line tamarin, Leontopithecus chrysopygus, or BLTs, as we more commonly call them. Amazing little species. It's thought to be extinct and rediscovered in about 1970. Still only about 1,000 in number. Now, this is a little species that's going to act as the flagship of the project. If you come to Durrell, up to the zoo, you'll see these little guys. But I presume that you maybe don't know, this is the only place outside of Brazil you can see them, Jersey. No one else in the world holds this species outside of Brazil. But part of our job is to build a population of a safety net. And we'll involve other zoos around Europe to build that safety net population in case there's a disaster in the wild, say a disease, for example. Now, these little guys are also important for the forest itself. I talked a little earlier about pollinators. The pollinators of tropical forests actually are quite often the mammals. Things like bats, incredible pollinators. At this point, I always like to mention why we should really take care of bats. They pollinate the agave plant. No bats, no tequila. Save the bats. And these little tamarins, they're also amazing seed dispersers and pollinators. They help build rainforests. So we're going to help these little guys safeguard their population, and hopefully by providing this connectivity between the forest fragments, we can grow their numbers. Because at the moment, what's happening, we know they're breeding. They're actually breeding quite well. But as soon as the youngsters try and disperse, they have to leave their forest patches. They have to cross open farmland. That is a disaster. They get taken by feral dogs. They die of starvation. All kinds of things happen to them. All they need is a way to get to the next forest patch. And that's what we could do. And of course, it's not just the little tamarins. There's a bunch of other amazing species, like this one. Now, Sir David's in there to remind me that if nothing else this evening, why we should help Rewild Carbon and save these little guys. This is the #1 species that Sir David would like saved from extinction. He's on record of saying that. So come on, let's do it for David. So David is an honorary fellow of Durrell, and he's been to see our tamarins. So for him, this is a special species. But there's also these amazing animals: jaguars, tapirs, giant anteaters, peccaries, also species like ocelots. One of my favorites, the tyra, the jaguarundi, and of course, so many different other species: birds, insects, amphibians, reptiles. Really rich biodiversity. And as we're doing that, we're also improving soil health. There's a huge problem worldwide in soil health. Intact forests really help with that. And they provide the pollinators that then go onto the nearby farmland. They protect the watershed. They provide the ecosystem services in which we are all entirely dependent. And that comes to the livelihoods. Everywhere we work, we try and engage with local people. And we have a number of projects. Agroforestry will be an important little part of this project. We'll be working with farmers, and we're choosing in conjunction with them, what do they want to grow? What do they find useful? And it's a number of different species, things like shade-grown coffee, pineapple, banana, avocado. Now, there is food insecurity in this area, so some of it will be for consumption, but some of it will also be for cash crop. But having an intact forest around their agroforestry plots helps with pollination. It helps grow their actual crops. So it will also act as a kind of stepping stone for species, but more than that, engages the local people, gives them real pride and purpose in the forest as well. And we know from speaking to our colleagues at IPE that the communities that are involved in growing the corridors are immensely proud because they can see it happening really quickly, that they have regrown their forests, the forest on which they depend, the forest on which we depend in terms of stabilising climates. So we have a number of community aims as well. We're going to be working in this first part of the project directly with about 250 families. The restoration services, in terms of the ecosystem services, we've calculated we're looking at about $7 million of gain for the local people in terms of those services provided. We're generating 1.5 million of local direct income from employing the local communities in the nurseries, which we use to build the seedlings for the forest. And of course, there's that sales from actual agroforestry for the local people, direct sales for them in their pocket that they can help to support their family. And we're also training. That's a very big part of what Durrell does. We don't just train conservationists, we train farmers in many different projects that we work in. So we'll be training local people in seedling collection, in seed collection and seedling production. We will be training them in terms of agroforestry. You can see there that we're going to take a train-the-trainer approach. So we'll concentrate first on 10 specific farmers. And we'll usually try and pick ones who are maybe leaders in their communities. And then they will train farmers after them as well. So if we provide that initial training, hopefully we'll get a cascade effect. And again, all of this gets measured by Durrell and IPE. We'll be measuring everything that we do. And we'll also be running a schools project talking about Rewild Carbon, forest recreation, and what the forest means in terms of everyone's everyday life. So that's the project. Now, we will, after this this event, we are going to send you lots of information. We have very detailed project design documents with lots of graphs of carbon, if you like that kind of thing. You'll be able to see the detail of what we do. So what would be the next steps be if you would like to invest in Rewild Carbon? Well, the first thing is to actually calculate your emissions. How much are we emitting each year? What does that look like? What's the scale? Which scope of emissions are we looking at? And we've got 2 great partners that we're working with to help you do that if you haven't currently calculated your emissions or you're wondering how to start. And we're working with Kit Consulting and the Good Jersey Life, because that's your first step. What are your emissions right now? And then what happens next? What do you expect from us? Well, the first thing is come and talk to us. Come and talk to us about what your emissions are now, if you've calculated them, what you want to do, because of course what we want to hear is this is our target for reduction. This is how we're going to make that reduction, which is so important. But this is how we want to offset right now. So once you've come on board, I'm sure you're all going to come on board, you'll get a certificate. We all like a certificate. You'll get some collateral that you could use to talk about the project to your customers, to your colleagues, to your staff, to your investors. You'll get an annual report and a biannual report, but of course, it doesn't need to be that static. If something exciting happens, the first time that we have a Jaguar walk through a corridor, you're going to know about it. And hopefully we're going to get to a point where the camera traps are set up so that you can see it from your offices, that you can see the forests that you are creating and you can see the people that you are supporting. Because most of all, what I'm sure that we can deliver is a real partnership and a collaboration. You could buy an off-the-peg offset project, but we're here and you can come and talk to us. We're just up the road. And we're always happy to talk about the project. This is the stuff we love doing. We want to do this. We want to save species from extinction and protect our environment. So we can talk about this all day long, believe you me. So any questions, of course, you could come to us and we could discuss it. So I hope that has made you a bit excited and keen to hear more and have that discussion with us about how you can be on that pathway to becoming carbon neutral. Now, we hope that you're going to become carbon positive. You're going to overpay. That's what we do for the emissions of the zoo. We overpay by about 25% to become carbon positive, to go that little bit further. And so hopefully you can see that this is not sticks of carbon. This is not a very simple project, but this is something much richer, much better. And together, we can literally build a rainforest. Thank you. Now, that's the kind of nuts and bolts of the project. But of course, we would have loved to have been able to let you meet our colleagues from IPE, these amazing conservationists in Brazil itself. We can't do that, obviously. But what we've got is a short film, and that's Lowry Cullen, who's an incredible guy, who I mentioned earlier. And Lowry has made a little film for us to talk a little bit more about the project, and we're just going to show that now.
I'm Lowry Cullen, and I'm a passionate for forest landscape restoration and community-based conservation. And our project is very proud to be a part of Durrell's Rewild initiative. The Brazilian Atlantic forest is one of the most important hotspots for the conservation of biodiversity in the world. And only 12% of the original area remains in highly fragmented landscapes. The Atlantic forest harbors more than 20,000 species, including the largest diversity of trees in the planet, over 400 species of mammals, and 1,000 species of birds. Today, we really continue to discover new species in the Brazilian Atlantic forest. The scale of forest fragmentation is vast, and it requires a large-scale solution. Our challenge is to mitigate forest fragmentation, helping the climate change, generating income for the rural poor, and saving many species from extinction. And here is a very important take-home message. Forest landscape restoration is a powerful tool for many global challenges. Restoring only 1/3 of the priority areas in the planet, we can revert 70% of the projected extinctions and neutralize half of the CO2 emissions made after the Industrial Revolution. We must reconnect. We must restore. The project aims to restoring large areas in private lands and also to promote connectivity between forest fragments and many protected areas in the Brazilian Atlantic forest. Promote the occupation of the restored areas and the connected areas by the local fauna. Promote the change in land use practice of small and large-scale farmers in rural fragmented areas. Improving small farmers' livelihoods and providing investors a return in the form of high-quality carbon offsets. Our nurseries grow over 100 different native tree species that lead to a high level of forest community composition, community structure, and ecosystem functions in the forest connectivity. Landscape restoration and forest growth is fast and can be even accelerated in the tropics. For this, we have developed the framework species method of forest restoration, a method that restores a functioning ecosystem in only 2 years. Once these trees have created the conditions to help natural regeneration, the next generation of naturally established trees, germinating from the seeds brought by animals, will restore a forest in its original condition. The local communities are the heart and a big part of our project. They plant the native trees in forest corridors, establish agroforestry systems, planting, and they own all the community nurseries for the production of the native seedlings. Farmers gain the knowledge, income, and the food security, and develop a sense of ownership and shared responsibility for the protection of the wildlife. To date, over 2,000 hectares of forests have already been restored in the region, with over 4 million trees planted. Due to our efforts, for example, the black lion tamarind was downlisted to a more hopeful category in the international red list of endangered species. We developed our dream map, guiding the creation of Brazil's largest reforestation corridor. The dream map is serving as a guide to IP's restoration activities in western São Paulo state, highlighting priority areas for reforestation and conservation. The partnership with Durrell and the Rewild initiative is like a blessing, an endorsement, a seal of approval, a testimony, and the best recognition our project ever had. It will pave the way for the apex of a long and passionate journey. With your help, in the next 5 years, we can restore another 5,000 hectares in forest corridors. You can also help to promote the employment of over 1,000 families. You will also help to generate over $10 million in local income, and also provide investors over 2 million tons of high-quality carbon offsets. Thank you for keeping our dream alive, and together we will do it.
thank you very much for tuning in this evening. I hope you feel inspired, and I hope you see that we do have the solutions to some of the big problems of the world, and together we can create a rainforest in Brazil that will help with climate, biodiversity and people. So if your business is interested in getting on board with Rewild Carbon, we would love to hear from you. So please get in touch and we can discuss more how your company can really pave the way for how sustainable companies act into the future.